friends, welcome to the series which we are doing on issues in world history, the 20th century, and today we will talk about rise of fascism and Nazism. In the earlier lectures on fascism and Nazism, we spoke about the kind of principles which were associated with these ideologies. We talked about how Mussolini and Hitler, both of them, they played an important role in Germany and Italy, in that sense where we find that Hitler was dominant in Germany and Mussolini in Italy, and how both these personalities they shaped the rise of Nazism and fascism in these countries. And when we talk about the kind of ideas which are associated with these movements or these kinds of ideologies, where we find that totalitarianism of the state was one of the important factors in both Mussolini and Hitler. Both of them, they proved to be the dictators. They were the ones, those who decided the kind of path which will be taken by the state in both these nations. So, in that sense, when we tend to understand, we earlier talked about Mussolini, and thereafter we also talked about the rise of Hitler with his 25-point program, and we find that how he adopted with a major focus on Greater Germany with the union of all Germans in a single state. So, the propaganda of Hitler was an important concern. His 25-point program was designed in such a manner that he was trying to attract all sorts of elements which were there in the German society, and he was also successful because the way he was able to mobilize masses because of his ideological positions and the kind of oratory which he had. And we find that how Germany became a totalitarian state, and how Hitler decided to crush all the opposition which was there when he assumes the power both within the party and outside the party. And we see that how the fascist state of Italy and the Soviet state of Russia, in the similar vein, we find that the German state also became a totalitarian state. And when you see the kind of policies which were followed by Hitler, we find that Hitler talked about in one of the decrees that there is only one political party in Germany, and that is the Nationalist Socialist Workers' Party. So, we find that how NSDAP or the Nazi party became one of the most important parties in the 20s in the framework of its propaganda, and in 30s, in 1933 to be precise, when Hitler becomes an important factor in the political scene. And we find that how the trade unions of the communists and the socialists, they were being dissolved, their offices they were being sealed, and their funds they were being confiscated. So, the policies of Hitler was to in a way make Nazi party as the only party, and rest of the parties, especially communists, etc., they were being crushed by him. Any kind of activity in which they were involved, their activities were crushed, and he did not want that any kind of opposition to the Nazi party should be there. And we find that when you talk about the Nazi regime, we find that they were not in favor of any kind of opposition which was shown to them, and it was not being tolerated if any kind of an opposition to the government or to the party was being done. And we find that the kind of meetings which were being conducted at that point of time, Reichstag meetings, they were just to applaud the Führer or the leader who was Hitler. And Hitler became so dominant in the scheme of things that his will was the will of the party and of the nation as well. And because of which we find that he becomes a dictator over a period of time, and he proceeded to direct Germany's national resurgence in the political, economic and cultural life of the country. So, as we find that he was a great critique of the Treaty of Versailles, and he talked about that how German pride was in a way destroyed because of the Treaty of Versailles, and there was a need for the German resurgence, and this resurgence could be achieved by negating the principles of or the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, and after that only Germany will become a powerful state. So, that was one of the important objectives of Hitler, and we find that he was in a way able to in a way draft, or in a way we find that he was able to bring about these kinds of policies and action, where we find that important elements of the Treaty of Versailles, they were being rejected by him. And also we find that in his work Mein Kampf and Jutersburg, Mein Kampf was his autobiography and Jutersburg was the second book which he wrote. In both these books his plans were comparatively more clear, that what he wanted to do with regard to his economic as well as foreign policy. And when we see that how various elements or various parts of the state, Gestapo or the German secret police service, wiped out the existence of all the opposition to the Führer. So the secret police was in a way behaving in that fashion, Gestapo as it was called, and any kind of an opposition which was there for the Führer or the leader, it was being wiped out by Gestapo. And we also see that the will of the state was so supreme, it became so important that individual liberty ceased to exist, it was not there. And we find that newspapers, they were either Nazified or abolished. So the press had to in a way accept or accede to what Hitler was saying, and the press had to in a way become the mouthpiece of Hitler, and various kinds of media, they were being controlled by the Nazi party and the government, and all sorts of information which was going out to the masses was regulated by the Nazi party or the people those who were associated with the Nazi party. And we find that how when such kind of ideas, they were there in the German society, and they were being borrowed from some of the other earlier philosophies, like practicing nihilism, which was that the reason becomes important and values are baseless and morals are invented. So these were the kinds of ideas which were being propagated at that point of time. And nihilism can be described as an idea that life or the world has no distinct meaning or purpose, and so there is no objective order or structure in the world except what we give it. So these kinds of ideas, they were being propagated by the Nazi party, that how reason was not an important component of our life, and it was an important force. And when you talk about these kinds of ideas, we find that Nazi party, they were trying that how morals, they were being invented and values are baseless. Such kind of ideas, they were being given prominence by the Nazi party. And when you talk about nihilism, we found that how it came out clearly in the terror and the murder of the innocents, the concentration camps and the gas chambers. So the kind of violence which was being perpetrated on the masses in the sense that those who were not considered to be Germans, Jews and other nationalities, and how the people, those who were disabled, they were also being in a way crushed by the Nazi party. And in that sense we find that how it was the essence of Nazi process which manifested itself through the organized killing of the millions of people by destroying the individual as a moral being. So that was the essence of nihilism, and this is how Nazi party or the people those who were associated with the Nazi party, they engaged themselves in that sense. And we find that when you talk about Nazi nihilism, how the purpose of this was to transfer a human being into a non-human and to restrict the quality of being human to those who were acceptable to the Nazi rulers. So we find that how the human beings, those who were being employed in the concentration camps, human beings, those who were serving the Nazi masters, they were in a way conditioned in such a manner, they were being trained in such a manner, then they were converted into non-humans, and how mechanically they were in a way obeying the orders of the party bosses, and in a way they were being devoid of emotions when they were there in the concentration camps, when they were trying to punish the non-Germans. On the other hand, these people, they also acknowledge that they were leading normal lives when they were going back their home. So, this kind of a dissociation which was being created when they were working in the concentration camps was another important component of the Nazi practices which we see. And as we discussed earlier as well, that how the rearmament of Germany was one of the important concerns of the Nazi party, that how the heavy armaments, particularly the armored cars, tanks and aeroplanes, they were to be made in huge quantities, and we find that in huge numbers these kinds of equipments, these kinds of vehicles, etc., they were being made so that they can rearm themselves in the fight. So, some kind of preparation for creating a situation of conflict, or in a way rearming Germany, in that sense that Germany becomes a dominant power, and how others they become in a way afraid of Germany, and unless Germany will exert its own strength, then we will find that Germany will not be able to put itself on a pedestal which it claimed that it had earlier, and how it was seen to be a greater country, how it was seen to be a great country, and how the kind of loss of its prestige after the First World War, and this prestige was to be restored by the activities which were being conducted by Hitler. So, we find that how Hermann Göring, a close associate of Hitler and his pilot, was appointed the commander of the German Air Force, and Nazis adopted the slogan "guns not butter." So, we find that these kinds of ideas which were being perpetrated, which were being propagated among the masses, and how the masses they had to choose guns and not food in the sense of butter. They were the kind of ideas which were being propagated so that the masses they in a way adapt to the ideologies which were being propagated by the Nazi party. And we also find that different kinds of ideas in the framework of the 25-point program, they were also being given, and how the 25-point program it catered to the various elements which were there in the German society, the nationalists, the socialists. So, all this was being done so that we find that over a period of time German Nazi party is able to establish its dominance. Another important factor that how the compulsory military service was to be given by the people, those who are of a certain age, and we find that it was introduced in 1935 in Germany, and Hitler blatantly repudiated the provisions of the peace settlement which placed limitations on its arms. So, we find that some kind of restrictions they were being placed during the Treaty of Versailles, that how the number of army men, the number of military personnel which can be employed by Germany. So, we find that through the conscription more and more people they were being trained in the military service. So, whenever the time will arise, whenever the need will arise, so they could be used in the German army. And we find that the kind of policies which were being followed by the Nazis, they were leading them on the path of war to wash away the stains of humiliation which they suffered in the First World War, and in a way they wanted to tear up the Treaty of Versailles. And another important component of the Nazi regime, or the kind of ideology which Nazis had, was in the framework of the treatment of the Jews. The way Jews they were being treated in the Nazi regime, where we find that how it was being referred to as anti-Semitism, and they can be traced to the teachings of Rosenberg, who held the superiority of the Nordic race as responsible for the great cultures of Greece and Rome in ancient times. and we find that how the decline of the German race was advocated on accounts of its intermingling with the inferior races. So, we find that how when you talk about the German race, when you talk about the Greater Germany, and how German race was considered to be some sort of a Aryan race, which was considered to be some sort of a superior race, and how the intermingling with inferior races was not an important thing in the in the present scheme of things. So, German race was losing its pride, it was losing its shine, and its pride could be restored if it did not intermingle with the inferior races at that point of time. And when they tried to find scapegoats, we find the Jews were seen to be the reason for the decadence and looked upon as the chief conspirators against the Nordic purity. And Hitler, when you talk about, he was talking about ideas of Lebensraum, which means the living space for a nation, where we find that more and more areas they need to be captured and to be brought under Lebensraum. And when we will have those areas under one's control, then we will find that more and more people from Germany, they could be settled in these regions, and the resources of these regions, they will also come to Germany in that sense. So, Lebensraum was an important component of Hitler's ideas, and we find that when you talk about a nation and how a nation could become strong, so we find that the fertility of the land was an important component, and the peasantry had to be contented. So, we find that how during Hitler's period, we find that Hitler had classified people as culture creators, culture bearers, and culture destroyers. So, in his ideas, we find Aryans were the culture creators, where we find the Germans, Dutch, and the British, they were there. And when you talk about in the sense that how Jews, who were the enemy, seen to be the enemies of the state, those who were seen to be the enemies of the supremacy of the Aryans, and how because of them cultural decadence had set in. And we also see that how Jews, they were being employed as, or they were working as international bankers, how they were more interested in money and in profit making than the well-being of the German people. So, these kinds of ideas about Jews, they were being circulated through the press by the Nazi party, and some kind of stereotypes, they were being created against them, that how these people were more interested in money and the profits, and they were not concerned with the well-being of the masses of Germany. And we find that this kind of conditioning, it began from a very young age, where we find that how schools, they were trying to communicate these ideas to children. And when you talk about this kind of conditioning, we find that how Nazi education was trying to shape the young minds into good Nazis. And we find that schools, they were being transformed into the propaganda machines of the Nazis, and the way school curriculum was being rearranged to include subjects like race studies and genetics. So, we find that various methods, they were being employed during this time, because of which we find that how Nazis, they will be able to propagate their ideas, and schools being one of the important concerns, because we find that the idea to catch them young began in school, and when school children, they will be conditioned in such a manner, when they will be indoctrinated in such a manner that whatever was being taught to them, they believe it to be true. And so, that was one of the important objectives of the Nazi party. And we find that many of the books which were not supposed to be read by good Nazis, they were being burnt publicly, and many of the liberal writers, they were being blacklisted and forced to stop writing as well. thus the thinking and writing too we find that they were being controlled. So, we find that Nazi ideology, Nazi program was designed in such a way that because of which we find that any sort of liberal thinking was not possible, and the people, those who were liberal in nature, those who had a liberal thought process, they were being blacklisted, and they were also being forced to stop writing as well. So, Nazis, they wanted to have a control over the various kinds of media, they wanted to have control over what was happening in the society, and we find that when Hitler assumes power, then there was an improvement in the economic situation, and the credit for the economic miracle was claimed by Hitler. So, 1930s was a period when Hitler assumes power, and when he assumes power, we find that some kind of an improvement in the economic situation was also taking place, and when this kind of development was happening, then we find that the credit for bringing about this kind of economic change was claimed by Hitler for himself, that the kind of policies which he followed, these were responsible for the revival of the German economy and what were developments which were happening in the German economy. So, we find that definitely such kinds of aspects, they were in a way fruitful for the Nazi party. And when Hitler indulges in the 4-year plans, where a lot of planning takes place with regard to the development of the German economy and how the centralization of the industries is to take place in the hands of the corporations such as Krupps to establish control over the economy. So, we find that how the capitalist section, which was an important contributor to the finances of the Nazis, which was an important supporter of the Nazi philosophy and ideals, because Nazis, they were seen to be, or rather they were against the communist elements, and the big capitalists, they were fearful that if the socialist elements, they will be allowed to prevail, then they will not be able to survive. So, they had their own interest in terms of supporting Hitler and Hitler's ideas when they were trying to crush the communist regime. And we find that when you talk about the rearmament plans after 1935, Germany's economy was geared up. There was a boom in the heavy industry, providing ample employment opportunities to Germans. So, as you can see on the screen as well, that when you talk about rearmament, which was an important component, and how because of the rearmament, the heavy industry in Germany was in a way booming at that point of time, and when people, they got employed in these industries, we find that a lot of employment opportunities, they were also being created because of these industries. So, we find that 1930s was a period where we find that more and more employment opportunities, they were being created for the masses, and the aim of Germany was to in a way support its own economy through various kinds of initiatives. Autarky was another, autarky means self-sufficiency. So, self-sufficiency was another important component of Hitler's policies, where he did not want to depend on the others in terms of its own economy. And we find that such kind of policies, they bore fruit as well, where we find that at different points of time German economy thrived as well. And we were also seeing that the way Nazi party was treating the workers, and how the workers were willingly parting with their freedom and liberty, and the labor unions lost their independence by becoming the front organization of the Nazi party in exchange for employment and social security. So, we find that the kind of liberty or the freedom which was being enjoyed by the workers initially, that was being lost, and how Nazi party, which was providing the employment and social security to them, they in a way had to barter their own independence and freedom. And we find that the people, those who were part of the economic reconstruction, all of them, largely all stakeholders, they were trying, not trying, rather they supported the Nazi party, and we find that how when you talk about the Germany, we find that how Germany expanded during this time, and how the influence of Nazism was not only restricted to Germany only, but its expansionist policy affected many other countries as well. And we find that it led to the denial of the basic equality and persecution of the Jews. So, German expansion was another important component of the Nazi policy, and we will talk about some other kinds of aspects which are associated with the Nazi party, and how Hitler seized the initiative at that point of time in terms of its policies, in terms of the activities in which he conducted himself. So, all that will be talked about in the next lecture. Thank you very much.